Hey guys, so welcome back to Grow Photography. Really happy you guys are tuning in. I've had an incredible amount of comments and amazing suggestions for future videos and so on, so I really appreciate that, and just want to extend my gratitude for all of you who have been who have subscribed to the channel, who have been coming there week after week to watch the videos, specifically all the street videos I've been putting out there. I've been really enjoying that, and the feedback I've been getting from my audience, you guys, has been phenomenal, so I really appreciate that, and that'll give me good reason to continue doing this, so thank you very much. So today I wanted to put together a post-processing video that basically will take you through my thought process on how I look at a street photograph and how I ultimately process that. And normally I use Adobe Photoshop. It's my favorite program for doing any digital darkroom work. I know some of you may use Lightroom, and there are lots of other tools out there. I tend to use Photoshop, so I'll use Bridge to kind of catalog my stuff. I don't use Lightroom a lot. I used to, and it's still a great tool, but I do prefer Photoshop because of I guess all the possibilities that Photoshop offers you with regards to post-processing. So here's the image for today that I've chosen. This is an image from a video that was Get Closer with Your Street Photography. So you may remember this one as one of the images near the end of the video, and I really like this capture from that day, because there was just something. I saw this image, I saw this woman on the left, here holding her, I guess those are shish kebabs or whatever they are, and then I guess there were some kids here having their ice cream, and this woman off to the right here who's kind of half cut off. I really like, this gesture with her hand and how that kind of played off of this gesture here of this woman's hand. And then just with these two kids, they're sort of lost in thought and kind of looking off. One is looking off to the left, the other to the right. I like this enough to do some work on it. So without further ado, let me get into this. Okay, so the first thing I think about here is cropping. Again, when you work quickly on the street, you're not always going to be able to compose something just right in the frame. Many times you can, but what I'll do here is I'll take my crop tool to begin with, and what I'm thinking is I really like what's happening here, but I want to probably remove this lamp on the left and this woman out here. So I'm going to start by cropping it something like that. I do want to include a little bit of that hotel sign in there, because that helps to kind of tell the story, and potentially this woman coming out of the building I may want to hold on to. I do want to get this half figure on the right, make sure that I get enough of the bottom here to not cut off this girl's feet any more than I've already got in the frame, and I think that's about right. So I'll just click on my hand tool to get there, and I'll have a look at it. So I like that as a starting point. Let's go there. And then the big question I know for many of you is, when do I keep it in color versus convert it to black and white? My personal preference is that unless there's something in the image that really speaks to you, where the color speaks to you, and there's an interesting play of color throughout the image, or the color has a meaning for the image, then I will typically want to use or convert this to black and white. Color can be distracting, right? If it's not an important part of the image, it can be a distracting component to take away from the form and from the, yes, you might say, the story that the image is trying to tell. So I've decided this is going to be in black and white. And you'll notice I have it open here in Camera Raw, because I always shoot in RAW. In camera, I have dual card slots on my camera. I'll always shoot in RAW and JPEG as well. In this case, I've got the RAW file open, and this is the default setting as it came through in Camera Raw. So the first thing I'll do is convert that to Adobe Monochrome as a starting point. And then I'm going to tweak the image in these camera raw settings before I open that up in Photoshop. So I'll start by right away just noticing that the highlights are a little bright. Check on my highlight clipping tool here. I'm not clipping any highlights, but I do want to tone down some of those highlights. I'll bring up the shadow slightly to get some more detail in there. And I do want to bump up the contrast a little bit. And just a touch of clarity. I don't want to overdo the clarity because that tends to increase the contrast throughout the entire image, which I may not want. I'll explain a little bit later why I'm thinking that way. So I bring my clarity up slightly, and I'm just going to move down through my tools here in Camera Raw. In the black and white mix, sometimes I will try to play with this balance here. This is a really interesting tool actually for black and white. If I want to bring more detail into skin tones, typically I can reduce the density of the oranges. You'll see there, because most skin tone is made up of that hue. Moving down under lens corrections, I will always make sure this is turned on, and the reason for that is I want to enable profile correction so that it will recognize my lens, the lens I've used, which in this case was a Pentax 21mm. I use that most of the time for my street photography. It's a small, compact, pancake, wide-angle lens. The last thing I'll say is that I want to open up my file in 16 bits per channel. Only because I feel comfortable starting if I'm doing any substantial post-processing with a 16-bit file. It's more, again, this is more critical when you're dealing with color photography and doing any substantial color shifts. But I will, I'll set that to 16 bits per channel, and then I will say open image. So I'll hit F on the keyboard just to bring this to full screen, and not have any distracting palettes and so on in the background, because I want to evaluate the image. So I'll just talk about this a little bit. First thing I'll do is look at it and say, well, what is it that I want to say with this image? What is best about this image? What is most important here? What do I want to bring out, and what do I want to diffuse in the image? When something is very bright in the image, it gets your attention quickly, and something is very contrast the image. So there's a few factors: sharpness, contrast, brightness, dealing with a black and white image. Those are the things that will attract the attention to the viewer. So if there are elements of the photo that I want to diffuse, I want to make sure that I reduce those things. I reduce the sharpness, the contrast, and the brightness in those areas. It's the way I kind of look at an image. So the first thing I'm thinking about is that this wall back here is really bright. This background is still bright relative to the important elements, which are these four figures in the foreground. These are the ones that I want to bring most of the attention to. Okay, so I already know that. And the first thing I'm going to do, and throughout my process, you'll see that I use mainly curves adjustments. And the reason for that is the curves adjustment allows you to affect, with ultimate control, your tonality of the image. And then through that, I can apply masks and then bring out or reduce whatever areas I want to affect. Okay, so I'll show you how we do that. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just kind of give the entire image a bit more of a gray cast. And the reason I want to do that is some of these brighter parts of the image in the background, I want to diffuse those. So I'm just going to reduce this down a bit. The other thing I'll do is I'll take my tones that are up here in the sort of, we call this around the 3/4 tone, and I want to bring those up a bit. So I might lock the quarter tone. And all I'm thinking about here is the background now. I'm not thinking too much about these foreground images. So the thing I do now is, obviously, this is my mask here. I'm going to take a brush by hitting B on the keyboard. I've got my brush tool, and I can use my square bracket, my right square bracket to enlarge the brush, left square bracket to reduce the brush in Photoshop. And I'm going to actually also reduce the opacity of that brush to, say, about 30% or so. And I'm gonna bring back in or some of the original image, which was a little brighter for these people in the front here. Okay, so I'm just gonna, again, because I'm working with a low opacity, I can kind of brush over this and be really kind of slow about this. All right. The other thing I'm going to do is just kind of brighten up the foreground where they're standing just a little bit. I will hit X on the keyboard to move my foreground color to white now, because what I want to do is just make sure I didn't brighten this up too much. So I'm going to go back on just this background wall here. I'm just going to make sure it's dark, just a little bit darker again, according to the curve I applied. So you'll see how we've kind of grayed out the background a bit. And I know this doesn't look like much right now, but just bear with me, okay? So again, I'm being really slow in articulating this stuff, and usually this happens fairly quickly. It's a really quick process for me, and you can even set up actions for yourself where you can have a variety of curves that do different things. I'm just going to call this layer here Darken Highlights. The next thing I want to do is an overall contrast curve. Okay, so I'm just going to back off on this, because sometimes if the image is smaller on your screen, it gives you a better idea of what is actually happening when you're really close to your screen. And if you fill your screen, it can be, you can start to focus on individual parts of the image, and that might not be the best thing when you're thinking about global adjustments. So I'm going to go back here into my adjustments panel, hit curves, and I'm just going to call this contrast. Okay, and let's bring that up. And a contrast, an S curve is always best, and an S curve basically just means we've got our brighter part of the image here. And if you want to know, if you're not familiar with this feature in Photoshop and when you're using curves, it's really, really handy. You can take this hand tool here, click on a part of the image that has a specific tone you want to address. And I'll give you an example here. I'll take this bright tone in this girl's face here, or yeah, let's choose that. And you can see that it's quite bright, so it's closer to the highlight, the extreme highlights here. I call this the quarter tone of the image. And then if I want to create a contrast curve, I want to choose a darker tone that I want to pull back. So I may pull up this bright tone, and then I'm going to choose this hand tool again and choose maybe a darker tone, like underneath this lady's chin here, and it's around the 3/4 tone. So I may bring that back, and you can see what we've done here. So this is your traditional S curve. By producing that S curve, I've given this thing a bit of a contrast bump here. Okay. So I like that, not liking so much that we're losing a lot of detail in her dress, but again, that's not a big part of that's not an important part of the image, so I'm less concerned about that. But again, because I have a mask here, I can go back in here with a brush. Again, I'm going to hit B. Okay, so if I want here, what I can do is take a brush, a soft brush, again, because I have this mask here. I can use a black, set my foreground color to black, and paint with black on this mask, and just bring back a little bit, again using a soft brush and a low opacity brush. I can bring back a little bit of detail in some of these areas. Okay, I'll wrap this up just a little bit. Okay, and I'm just going to work quickly. I want this gentleman to come through just a bit, some of the detail here. This woman's face here, just bring back a little bit of that. Okay, not a lot. And that's a contrast bump. Okay. Next thing I want to do is apply sort of a vignette. What I want to do is I really want to darken up some of these edges of the frame to bring more emphasis again to these foreground these people here in the foreground. So I'm going to go to curves and be pretty drastic with this. I'm going to bring this right down. Again, I've got my mask, and like I said, I'm using curves throughout. I'm going to call this vignette. I love to use curves throughout to apply edits. Okay, now this looks fairly dark, of course, but all we're going to do is fill that with black. Okay, so Option Delete will fill the mask with the foreground color. And then what I'm going to do is again take a fairly soft brush. Let's go to about 30-40% here. And set my foreground color to white and just paint in just kind of dark. I'm doing this manually here. Sometimes you can take a shape and apply a vignette to it like that, but I like to work this manually because I want some parts of the image to, I want it to be more organic, some parts of the image to be darker than others. I'm feeling the top of the image here needs to be quite a bit darker. Maybe just a bit of the foreground right there, and the side just here, the edge of where this lady is standing. Okay, so you'll see how I just like to turn that on and off to show you how it's made a difference. And I'm just going to zoom in just a touch here now. You'll see how that's made, given, again, more attention, or more, the viewer will be sort of more focused on what's happening in the foreground here. Because sometimes these things in the background, these bright areas, can really take your eye away, or at least steer you off the screen. We have darken, highlights, contrast, and a vignette. Okay, it's starting to come together. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is really focus on these foreground, these people in the foreground, really make them pop, okay? And this time I'm going to improve the contrast as well, but I'm going to get a little bit more extreme. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to really bump up the highlights more. And I'm going to take these tones that are fairly close to that and just exaggerate them, okay? And again, when I set my mask, fill my mask with black, now I can use a white brush. I've got white as my foreground color. I'll hit B again and use a fairly small brush. That's again, maybe 40 to 50% or so. And I will start to bring detail into, or some of that contrast into some of these figures here in the foreground, okay? This gesture of her hand. Now, once I've done this masking, and I'm going to just do a little, add a little bit of that contrast to the front pavement that they're standing on as well. Okay, you can see how much of a difference that makes. The great thing about using curves, like in this case, is that, you know, once I've done the masking, you can see how kind of loose this masking is. I can open this up and then fine tune. I know that I've isolated the areas I really want to bring out. I can then fine tune this. So if I felt that I was going a little too much in one area, I can move this curve around and then really see how it's affecting the image. And I'm finding that I tend to always adjust it after the fact, or after I've done my masking. Okay, so I'm going to do that. And I'm going to bring the shadows up a bit. I find the shadows a little strong. Okay, and I always like to turn it on and off to see if it's gotten any better. You want to evaluate at all times, because sometimes when you're in the thick of the action and you're making adjustments and you're applying a curve, yeah, you get a feeling that it looks better, but you're not always. I find that you could be going too far, or maybe not going far enough. So always evaluate your image, and having adjustment layers like this allows you to turn things on and off and engage it. So when I do that, I say, okay, I'm thinking to myself, some areas I do like that they're going brighter, other areas not. So again, the strength of the mask is I can go back in here now and say, I don't want that adjustment applied so much to this girl's shirt. I kind of like that it was a bit deeper. This woman's legs here, I'm going to just reduce my opacity down. This ice cream, I just want to make that a little bit. I want to bring some of that tone back. I didn't want it quite as bright. Same with this woman's face. Near the top here, not so much, but I do like what's happening in here. this girl's face, and most of the foreground here that I've altered. I like what's going on there. Okay. The other thing you can do is, you know, go back into some of these adjustment layers later on and say, hey, I maybe could have gone even a little further with that. Now, I don't think so in this case, but maybe the shadows just slightly. There you go. Okay. Contrast wise, I think that's pretty good. And I like what I've done here. Okay, so the other thing I'll talk about is, you know, even when I've gotten to this point, now I want to do some more extensive dodging and burning. So what we can do in this case is if I select all these layers and hit on a Macintosh Command Option Shift E, that will make a composite of everything that's below it, and I usually will call that comp. The other thing I will do at this point is I'll usually select these layers that where I've made some edits and hit Command G on the keyboard, and what that does is it puts those edits into a group. I will call that edits. Again, I'm taking my time explaining all this. This is usually done very, very quickly, and it's kind of a go-to process for me. So then I can always turn that entire edit on and off to see how much of a change I've made to the image. So one thing I notice right here is that it's still a little heavy in this part of the image for me, and it's a little bit too bright in some other parts of the image. Okay, so what I'm going to do with the comp is that I'm going to use my dodge burn tools. So I'm going to take my burn tool, and with the burn tool set to shadows and about 10%, I can start to darken up some parts of this image. The other thing I'll do here now is just switch to my dodge tool and set this to highlights, okay, versus the shadows. I'll bring that up to about maybe 10 to 12%. It's a bit of an extensive retouching tutorial here. I hope it's not going too long. You guys will let me know if it's too lengthy, but I feel I just wanted to make it really extensive and detailed. And you can pull out of this whatever you like in terms of, you know, how much of this do I want to use? Is it too time consuming for me? Maybe it's best for you to just have a preset. Start with that and then work from there. Like I said, when I do this stuff, it's fairly quick and natural for me. So I work pretty quickly. But the other thing I will do is I will move over to the midtones, and I will actually try to bring back some of the midtones here. Okay, so I'm just going to work quickly and show you what I'm talking about here. All right. It's getting quite close now. So what I want to do now is I want to apply a couple of levels of sharpening. The other thing I'm noticing is that this bright part of the image back here is still kind of bright. Still very bright, this wall here. So the thing I can do is I can work on this comp layer. I can take my burn tool, shadows, and I'm just going to actually, not shadows, let's go to midtones here. I'm just going to darken this up a little bit. I'm going to get less emphasis on this part. And again, if you're working with a soft brush, these are going to be very smooth transitions, so you will not notice. It's almost like if any of you have ever worked in a traditional darkroom where you take when you do your dodging and burning, it's usually a very using a very subtle approach. So it's almost like using a soft brush in the digital darkroom. It's very similar. Okay, I'm going to take my burn tool here, and the other thing I want to do is just zoom in on this woman's face and go to shadows. I want to bring some strength to those features. Okay, same thing here, just on the edges. darken up some of these. It's almost like we're painting with light now, okay? We're adding tone, contrast to very specific areas of the image. Just as kind of a finishing touch, right? And the lower the opacity, the slower you can work, and the smoother those transitions can be. So again, these are just little fine touches. Again, Command Option Shift E, and I'll call this Sharpen, and call it Sharpen Contrast because it's a curve that I apply. It's actually an Unsharp mask layer. So I'll show you how that works. We go under Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, and what I'm going to do here is apply what's called a low amount, high radius sharpening, and I call that, let's reduce this to 50%, a contrast enhance. So this is quite low. It's going to 20%. It's a little different from your fine sharpening. I'm going to set my threshold right to 0, my radius up to 50. And you can see, if you look at the little preview here, you can see how much pump impact and how that pumps contrast into the image. The downside of that is in some cases it goes a little too far. So I'll show you what I do with that. I apply it globally to the entire image. Okay, in this case, and that's my starting point, 2050. Then, as usual, I will apply a mask to it, fill that mask with my foreground layer, which is foreground color, which is black, and I'll zoom in on this, take a brush, Command B, or just B on the keyboard, and I will bring that contrast by using a white brush only into some parts of the image. This hand, again, looking at the important gestures in the image. What should have impact, you know, and just trying to enhance those while leaving the other less important stuff alone. Now this gentleman's kind of an important part of the image. He helps the composition. So there's this woman, but they're not as important, obviously, as these foreground figures. So what I can do, though, is just subtly, with a soft brush, bring them out a little more as well. You really need to zoom in to see the effect of this, but you can see how all those little bits help to add more impact and more flavor sort of to the image. Okay, the last thing you can do, if you like, depending on the image, is apply some fine sharpening. So again, I'm going to select all of these. I'm going to hit, on my keyboard, I'm going to go Command Option Shift E. That'll create another comp layer, and I'll call this Fine Sharpen. And again, I'm going to go to my Unsharp mask. And this time, my amount is going to be upwards of 150 to 200. Let's start with 150. My radius is about 1. This can change anywhere between like a 0.8 to a 1.2 or 1.3, depending on, and I'll just demonstrate for you what that is. You see how it starts to become kind of coarse and unnatural in terms of the sharpening if you bump that radius up too high. So as a standard, try to keep it around 1. Now this was shot, I think I'm just going to look at the camera settings here. I believe this was shot at higher than 100 ISO. This is why we're getting quite a bit of noise, a little bit of noise in here. It doesn't bother me. I think it works really great for street photography to have a little more noise. And then my threshold controls the amount of noise. Okay, so I'm just going to zoom in to show you how that, for any of you who are not familiar with it. As I bump the threshold up, areas of less contrast are not sharpened. So can see as I bring that up how very few areas are sharpened. I'll just preview and you'll see that it's receiving no sharpening whatsoever. So the threshold at 0 means that every single pixel is being sharpened. Once you bump that threshold up, the areas of lower contrast, like for example these soft parts of her skin, will not be sharpened, and that's what you want. You want the higher contrast areas to be sharpened without these soft sort of flat areas to receive any sharpening. Okay, so you'll see there that we're still getting some sharpening in here. I could bump this up a little bit higher. Let's go to 7, and now we're getting again the strands in her hair, the ice cream here, you know, detail of around her eyes and etc. being sharpened, and a little bit of these areas, but not so much. And you can see that I'm zoomed in quite big here at 1:1, but normally for previewing this you want to go to 50% and see what that looks like. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to say okay. And again, what I'm going to do here is not apply it to the entire image, because I want to bring that fine sharpening to only those parts of the image that deserve more attention. So fortunately I have this mask here that I use for the previous sharpen, that I can just hold the Option key on and drag it up to this layer here. Now it's just going to adopt the same mask, which means it's affecting only those areas again that I wanted to sharpen previously. Okay, so that's a quick route into not having to do all that masking again. And we'll just look at that, and you can see that all these little things help. Okay, especially if you're ever going to be printing this, it would be important. Just back off and have a look at that again, always evaluating the image with every move you make. Just kind of a quick evaluation to see whether you're on the right track. So I kind of like where that's heading for myself, and I'd be pretty happy with that at this point. The next thing, or the last thing I'll do here is I have a filter that I like to use. It's part of the Neek collection. I don't know if any of you remember this. This is, I believe, DxO owns this collection of plugins now, but it used to be, for a while there, it was being sort of offered for free through Google. Actually, Google bought the rights to this and was giving it out, and I grabbed a copy and I've got it installed here in Photoshop, and I'll show you how that works. It's great because, and I'll just jump here next. I'm just going to create another layer. Command Option Shift E again as a composite. So before we do that, we're going to have to convert our image to RGB. So as I said earlier, this was opened up as a grayscale image because that set of filters does not recognize grayscale images. So I'm going to go to Mode and go to RGB. I'm going to say don't flatten. I want to keep all these layers intact. And now I'm going to select that top layer, go under Filter, Neek Collection, and use this this part of Neek Collection, which is called Silver Efex Pro. And I love this set of plugins. This is fantastic. I have a preset that I use. It's taken from their Tri-X preset after Kodak's famous Tri-X 400 film, and I've tweaked it slightly. So I've just gone in and given it a slight contrast curve, which can be changed from image to image. I'm also going to go in here, and you can see you have a whole selection of different film types that you can use here. You know, applying global adjustments to brightness, contrast, tonality. You also have control points. So if I wanted to go in here, apply a control point, for example, I can then, just for that part of the image, I can affect the contrast, brightness, or structure of the image. So I'll just show you how that works. You see how I can brighten only that part of the image up. Okay. I don't want to do it in this case, so I'm just going to remove that. But again, it's pretty incredible what you can do with it, making, you know, tonal adjustments to certain really specific areas. But again, in this case, I usually just use this for their Tri-X curve, because I love the grain structure of Tri-X, and what it does gives that image a very organic sort of film-like look. So I set my film type here, the grain structure, to fairly soft here, and I'm gonna zoom in just a bit to show you what that looks like. And I'm gonna bring the grain per pixel up a little bit. I don't want it quite as dramatic. Okay, that is good. The other thing I do here is I usually do a final curve adjustment here. Okay, I'm just gonna bring this up a little bit. And I can always hit the compare button up here to see where I was and where I'm at. Okay, see that? This might have come across just a little bit bright. Just gonna bring that down a bit and just change the tone of that. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. You see how it's added a nice contrast bump again to the image as a final sort of bump. And it's got that real film, gritty kind of film look. So I'll say okay. And there you have it. That's my post-processing workflow for street photography. It's quite lengthy. I hope it's not too long for you guys to go through. I think I've tried to be as detailed as I can, because I know that quite a few of you have been asking, and I thank you very much for commenting and sort of sending me those notes for those of you who have asked for this. Hopefully you get something out of this. I know it seems fairly lengthy. Again, take little pieces from this that you find can help you with your own post-processing. I hope that helps you, and I'm really excited to bring you many, many more videos coming up, so stay tuned. If you like what I'm doing here, as always, please give me a thumbs up on this, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And I look forward to seeing you guys very, very soon. Peace out and have yourselves a fantastic day.